Good afternoon and welcome to the Teen Suicide Prevention webinar. This webinar is brought to you by the planning team of Focus, which is family-oriented concepts unified to serve. My name is Adrienne Conwell, Chair of Focus. We are a collaborative team of religious professionals and social service providers committed to working throughout Pinellas County on behalf of children and families. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. The chat feature for everyone is disabled. However, you can use the Q&A feature. Now, be prepared for an educational webinar on teen suicide prevention, for which you will hear from some dynamic speakers who are subject matter experts.
Thank you, Adrienne. Adrienne has done a great job stepping in as our new chair for Focus after the retirement of Pastor Bill Lasasso, and she's done a great job, so we appreciate you so much. We are so happy that you're joined us today. As Adrienne said, we've got some amazing speakers, and to start us off this morning, we have April Lott. Many of you may know April. She has been in Pinellas County her entire life, and she has been one of the movers and shakers in the social service area of our county. She's currently the president and CEO at Directions for Living. And if you're not familiar with Directions for Living, it's a commission on accreditation of rehabilitation facilities accredited not-for-profit child welfare and behavioral health organization, providing a comprehensive network of services promoting safe and stable families. They have an incredibly large staff, and you know, as president and CEO, she's got a hard job keeping up with almost 450 employees and over 100 volunteers. She's transformed Directions for Living to being a leader in the philosophy and practice of trauma-informed care. She holds a Master of Social Work and has over 30 years of experience in the provision of child welfare services in the state of Florida. Now, April doesn't just work at Directions for Living. She serves on many boards and committees at a local, state, and national level, with a focus on child welfare, behavioral health, early childhood trauma, and child abuse prevention. She's the current chair of the Pinellas County Crisis Intervention Team, training for local law enforcement agencies. She's also the chair of the Homeless Leadership Alliance's Providers Council, and she's an appointed member of both the State Child Abuse Death Review Committee and the statewide Crisis Intervention Rapid Response Team. Additionally, April is a featured guest speaker on a local television talk show discussing issues related to relationships, mental health, and wellness. She is a wife of 35 years and the mother of 2 adult children. And let me just say, I happened to watch the webinar that was done with the Pinellas County Teen Council, where they interviewed her about the prevention of teen suicide, and it was amazing. And so we are so happy and fortunate. She is an amazing trainer, whether it's in the mental health first aid, whether she was the keynote for our out of school time providers. April, it's such a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you so much for all that you bring to our community.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so grateful to be here today, and we have such an important topic. So I'm going to jump right in. Perfect. Okay, so we're here to talk about the realities of teen suicide in Pinellas County. I will really kind of speak generically relative to teen suicide in our country. We'll talk a little bit specifically about Pinellas County. We'll hear later from our medical examiner, Bill, who will give us more details, I think, about Pinellas County specifically. My name is April Lott. I am a licensed clinical social worker. This is my contact information. If anybody needs me for any reason following this presentation, I do so hope that you will reach out. So I just want to remind us all that it is all of us that we are talking about. I certainly remember with vivid clarity where I was when I received the call that my 19-year-old nephew had died by suicide. It was just a couple of years ago, and I'll talk a little bit about that experience as we go, but I do just want to be sensitive to the fact that of the 300 people who are with us today, that we all may know someone who has died by suicide, who we loved and cared for. We may also know someone who's attempted to die by suicide. Certainly we know that there could even be somebody in the room today watching that has considered suicide in their past, and we want to be sensitive to all of those things as we move through this very, very sensitive topic. If I could see you right now, I would ask you to raise your hand if you know someone who has died by suicide. That is often the question that I ask when I am training on this topic. And nearly every time that I've asked the question, more than 50% of the room raises their hand in acknowledgement that they in fact have known someone who has died by suicide. Teen suicide in particular and suicide in general has touched all of us, and it is important that we understand just how massive this problem is. I do just want to address stigma. As many of you no doubt know, there is a reluctance to admit or discuss that a loved one has died by suicide. Many of you probably know that suicide is obviously a very, very prevalent issue in our country, and yet it's rarely talked about. You rarely would see it, for example, in an obituary. People have stigma related to talking about it. There are consequences to sharing thoughts of suicide with others. People often have shame, self-blame, and all of those things when they lose someone to suicide. But it is important to know that on average, someone who dies by suicide leaves behind 135 people who will mourn their loss. So I just want to say thank you to all of the organizers of this workshop today. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's very brave that we're having this conversation and that all of you have joined us for this topic. Just related to stigma, I just want to give a little story. A couple of years ago, my husband, who is an attorney, he is corporate counsel for a road construction firm. The owners of the road construction firm lost their son, their teenage son, to suicide. And I wanted to send a sympathy card. And in that sympathy card, I acknowledged the death by suicide. I took the card and asked my husband to sign it, and he refused and said, if you're going to use the word suicide, if you're going to put that word in there, is exactly how he said it. If you're going to put that word in there, I'm not signing the card. And so it is important that we all understand that there is a stigma and alive and well. I am happy to say that approximately 24 to 36 hours later, he was willing to sign the card acknowledging the death by suicide. So I want to set the stage for us here today. Obviously, this is a very large topic, and the time that we have certainly doesn't allow us to go into all of the things that we might want to talk about today. There may be other opportunities in our future to kind of dig into some of these topics, but there is a difference between suicide thoughts, suicide attempts, and completed suicides. I will be very sensitive to language today. I hope you'll make note of that. As we talk about suicide, saying someone died by suicide is an appropriate way, or completed suicide is also an appropriate way to talk about death by suicide. Self-harm is different. We're not going to spend a lot of time on self-harm. We certainly know that self-harm can unintentionally lead to death by suicide, but self-harm is different. Death by suicide is 100% preventable. I know that's somewhat controversial to say, but it is in fact preventable. And speaking about suicide as a preventable death is important to do. Teen suicide, specifically 15 to 24-year-olds, is the second leading cause of death in the United States. That was published by the CDC in 2016. Certainly, we all know that youth younger than 15 are dying by suicide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on statistics, but certainly statistics are available to you, literally through a simple Google search. While suicide is 100% preventable, death by suicide is not necessarily predictable. It is important to note that in one study, self-report by suicide survivors, 64% of them had attempted to die by suicide very impulsively, made the decision, and it was a very impulsive decision. And approximately 36% had planned their suicide in advance. So it is not always predictable. I do just want to give us a little bit of trend data. As you can see, this is trend data from 2009 through 2019. What's particularly noteworthy about those years, of course, is that was prior to COVID. So we will talk a little bit about COVID as we move through. Again, we won't have enough time to really dig deep into the impact of COVID, but these trends, as you can see, are prior to the pandemic. So what you can see here is that the percentage of high school students who felt sad or hopeless for 2 or more weeks in a row increased in this 10-year period from 26.3% to 33, almost 34%. What's important about that is feeling sad or hopeless for 2 or more weeks in a row is leaning in the direction of a diagnosis of depression. Seriously considered attempting suicide, that also increased from just under 12% to almost 16%. Making a plan to attempt suicide also increased. Purposefully hurting themselves without wanting to die, so self-harm, also increased. Those who attempted to die by suicide increased to just under 8%. And those students or teens who had used a prescription drug not prescribed to them also increased to just under 14%. This report is produced by the Public Health Research Unit, Florida Department of Health, Florida Department of Education. This study is available to you if you are interested. The impact of COVID on teens is certainly something that we all, I think, are concerned about and have certainly turned our attention to. We know that death by suicide for our teens has been a problem for many years, and COVID has simply increased that risk quite dramatically for some pretty obvious reasons: isolation, loneliness, the shutdown. The CDC says emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts by boys rose 3.7%, jumped nearly 51% for girls. In Tampa Bay, Baycare Health System said essentially 4 out of 5 of its emergency psychiatric patients this past winter were teen girls. Some of you may have had the opportunity to hear Gail with Baycare speak about what was happening in our emergency departments, especially related to our teen girls. Baycare said pediatric patients making psychiatric emergency room visits to its 15 Florida hospitals jumped 31% in the first 5 months of this year, 2021, compared to the same period last year, and the admissions increased by 26%. So we certainly know that our teens, boys and girls, are presenting to the emergency department. The acuity of their symptoms and of their emotional pain is off the charts, and certainly we know that COVID has contributed to that fact. So let's talk a bit about who is at risk for suicide. Remember, we're talking right now around teens. I'm going to include, preteens in that category. But again, I just want to remind all of us that we have children as early as 5 years of age speaking about dying by suicide, who have that needed to go into a hospital in order to keep them safe. So we are talking about certainly all children. I think the one category of students that we often overlook and that we often aren't taught are at risk are our high achievers. So those students who have good grades, appear to have good groups of friends. They are our athletic stars. They have success in various areas of their life. They're the captain of the swim team, the quarterback of the football team. They're a straight A student. We need to understand and begin paying attention to that category of students. The other thing we know is that our students who are at risk of suicide, who complete a suicide, often are not connected to services. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we go, but it is important to know that sometimes they have not had an identified mental health condition, a mental illness, or a mental health crisis, and yet they certainly are at risk for suicide. Certainly, we know high ACE scores contribute to a suicide risk. Again, my assumption is the vast majority of us here today are familiar with adverse childhood experiences and understand the questionnaire. That questionnaire is 0 to 10 points. The higher the score, the more at risk that individual or student would be for the risk of suicide. If you're not familiar with ACEs, I would encourage you strongly, and you're working with teens or you're working with children in any way, even adults for that matter, that you would go into your search engine, just type in ACE''S, lots of things will come up. I would encourage you to get very familiar with ACEs. We also know that students who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, queer, any of the sexual identity and sexual orientation questions that they are going through puts them at greater risk for suicide. Again, I think that's a topic in and of itself, and one that we as a community probably need to spend more time on. Certainly, we know that all children, in particular teens, are at risk, and we should not exclude anyone from the groups that we are paying attention to and listening to as we work with youth. There are some causal factors that we want to spend just a minute on. There are both external sources or causal factors and internal sources. We often spend a lot of time kind of on the internal sources and don't pay as much attention to the external sources. I want to run through them pretty quickly. Bullying at home or at school tends to be a causal factor to a student or a child considering, contemplating, thinking about suicide. Cyberbullying, as you know, has grown to be a very large issue in the past many years. Problems with alcohol or drugs, abuse, neglect, or trauma, such as domestic violence, alcohol misuse, divorce, those kinds of things happening at home. Again, kind of reflecting back to ACEs. Parents with a psychiatric condition. If a student knows someone who has died by suicide, particularly somebody in their household or their family, can certainly increase a risk. Isolation and loneliness are two that I think we need to spend a lot more time on as a community and as protective adults who serve children. Isolation and loneliness are two that really are very common denominators in the life of a student or a child who has made the decision to die by suicide. And I think we can impact loneliness differently than we have. As you know, isolation and loneliness certainly have been compounded by COVID. And so some of the numbers that I shared just a minute ago about psychiatric admissions into hospitals begin to make sense. Then there are their internal sources. We spend quite a bit of time actually talking about depression, and I will spend some time talking about depression today. Certainly there is a high correlation between somebody who is depressed, has a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, and dying by suicide. We also need to think about things like perfectionist. Being a perfectionist, that's kind of back to our high achieving students that we often overlook and who get by us in terms of their emotional pain and or their need for services. We often miss it because we value sometimes perfectionism and success in academic settings and sports settings and that kind of thing. And so we often overlook and or miss some of the warning signs. Certainly we know that anxiety goes often hand in hand with depression, and anxiety in and of itself can be a internal source of contributing to a suicide. Insomnia and other sleep disturbances. Sleep and sleep hygiene obviously is very, very important. And when sleep is disrupted, especially for an ongoing period of time, people, our teens, adults, all of us cannot think clearly, and it really can be a causal factor to thoughts and or plans of death by suicide. Some other high risk factors that certainly I want to make sure all of us here today are aware of. Things like a prior suicide attempt. We know that students who've had a prior attempt are at high risk of a future attempt. So we want, the reason that becomes a challenge is because of the stigma that I talked about earlier, and we often don't know. This is often not information that we have, depending on our role, if we're educators or caregivers or working in the child welfare system or working even in outpatient services. It is often information that we don't have, and yet it is incredibly important for treatment and for future. Things like a family history of suicide, also very important. If this child has someone in their family who has died by suicide, we know that that makes, that is a high risk factor. Physical illness, I think that is probably pretty obvious, but for students, for children who are living with chronic pain, headaches, backaches, unexplained pain, tics, those kinds of things can be high risk factors. Changes in body like puberty, obviously we know that our teens are going through a lot, just physiologically, they're going through a lot, and puberty can in fact be a high risk factor. Beginning an antidepressant can also be a high risk factor. Being adopted, studies and research shows, again, just around this disconnection and feelings of connection. And then periods of transition. So students going from middle school to high school, going from high school to college, and other periods of transition can also be a high risk factor. And things that we want to pay attention to. Obviously, during periods of transition, there's lots of hope often and joy and excitement, but there can also be lots of fear and anxiety that we want to balance as we talk about those things with our youth. So is this depression or normal teenage angst? I think is a fair question for parents. For those of you who are parents of children, or who work with parents of children, I think sometimes because our teenagers are so hard to figure out, that's really just a part of being a teenager, that it makes it so hard to determine, is it depression? Is this just simply being a teenager? Things like occasional bad moods, melancholy moods, being rebellious, all of those things come with puberty, come with being a teenager. And so sometimes we miss it. I would just encourage all of you, in particular, that work with parents who have children. It is hard to know the difference. And so when in doubt, talk to your pediatrician or other trusted professional. In other words, don't just brush it off and chalk it up to adolescence. normal adolescence, typical adolescence. If you are concerned about behavior change in your student, in your child, please, please, please talk to someone that you trust about those things. Depression, again, I'm going to spend just a second on depression. It is more than just moodiness. It is extended periods of sadness and despair. Some of the things that you might see in a youth who is experiencing depression would be fatigue, irritability, loss of appetite, headaches, insomnia. What's important, I think, to know about depression is the prevalence of depression in our teens, in our youth. 1 in 5 girls, approximately 7% of our boys. The thing about depression, though, is that nationally what we know is that it is undiagnosed. Most people who live with depression, even symptoms of a major depressive disorder, the vast majority of them, 50% or more, never seek treatment, never have a formal diagnosis. So please just know that depression is, in terms of prevalence, is very, very common, not only, of course, in our children, but in adults as well. We talked earlier about isolation and loneliness really being being a common denominator in those who have died by suicide and those who have attempted to die by suicide. The things that we want to talk about in terms of isolation and loneliness really is this feeling disconnected from others. The reason it's important to understand that it's a feeling is because as you look at this individual, it may not seem real. In other words, they may in fact have a lot of people around them. They may have close friends. They may have lots of things that appear to look like they are in fact connected to others. But it is a feeling of being disconnected, of feeling alienated, of feeling like I don't have the friends that I want, or the boyfriend or the girlfriend, the relationships that I had hoped to have at this point in my life, feeling like a burden to others and that people would be better off without them. Oftentimes, people who are contemplating suicide report feeling like they're drowning, feel like they're only one who's going through these thoughts, these feelings, this heaviness, and feeling like they are all alone. Isolation and loneliness is oftentimes very internal as opposed to external, and which is something I hope all of us can begin to pay attention to, especially as we talk with our students and talk with our teens and talk with our young people, is that we're asking questions that would get us to this information. And then when you have all of those things combined with hopelessness or believing that things will never change, is when that becomes a significant risk for suicide. There are some gender differences. Girls are more likely to receive treatment, but again, I just want to say that's about 45%, which means 55% of our girls aren't receiving treatment. Treatment and identification and diagnosis is actually less than 50% in both boys and girls, youth and adults, by the way. Girls are attempting and thinking about suicide more often than boys. However, boys are more likely to die by suicide. But I do just want to say that that gender gap is narrowing, which is alarming and increasing. Suicide, as you know, is increasing from a percentage standpoint. It is increasing in something we need to certainly take very seriously. 7 in 10 teens identify anxiety and depression as an issue. That shouldn't surprise any of us in this day and age with COVID, that anxiety and depression are what our children are holding and carrying. Oftentimes what we see is children acting out their emotional pain. I always like to say it's like a red flashing light on top of their forehead. If you see these behaviors, it is very easy to get frustrated, to get angry, to get judgmental about these behaviors. And what I would ask you to do is to contemplate and or consider that they really are a flashing light to say, help me, help me, help me. Acting out emotional pain is what our children, what our youth do. When they're hurting, they tell us through their behavior. They often do not tell us through their words. So using words like I am hurting are not words that we often will hear. Instead, we will begin to see problems at school, low energy, poor attendance, dropping grades, staying up all night, not sleeping, not being able to get up on time, running away, beginning the use of drugs or alcohol, or increasing use of drugs and alcohol, smartphone addictions, staying on screen time, not wanting to come to dinner, not wanting to socialize with their parents or their siblings. Of course, things like eating disorders. Some of those things are hard to identify because all of our teens are identifying with losing weight and not being good enough and those kinds of things. So if we begin to see, and obviously this is a very short list of the ways our teens act out their emotional pain, please just be sensitive that when students or teens or children are acting out, it's often a very strong indicator that something else is going on. Some indirect risk factors that I think we all need to be paying attention to are things like having access to any of these items increases suicide risk. So the presence of controlled prescriptions, pain pills, anxiety medications, those kinds of things prescribed to somebody else in the home. Maybe those prescriptions are being used appropriately, but nonetheless, they are in the home and available. They're not locked up. They're in that home. The presence of guns or other lethal means, and the presence of illegal drugs. I do just want to say to all of you that it is acceptable to ask adults whose homes your teens or the teens that you are working with visit if these items are in the home. These are indirect risk factors, and I think we'll talk, and I think Bill will talk about some of them maybe later today. This was a quote that came from a client. Why does my therapist think I'm suicidal because I am depressed? Did it ever cross her mind that I am depressed because I have constant suicidal thoughts? I thought that was very interesting, and one that is getting some attention from a research perspective across the country is could suicidal ideations be a diagnosis in and of itself and not necessarily the reverse? Depression equals suicide risk. Could it in fact be suicidality as a diagnosis in and of itself, and depression falling from that? So some warning signs that we all want to be paying attention to, things like drastic changes or fluctuations in behavior. We talked about those. Isolating. Social media posts. We are all aware that children are posting things on social media that certainly indicate they are at risk of self-harm or dying by suicide. Paying attention to communication, things like students saying, I am struggling, I am tired. I am tired is a very common exclamation around someone who is really feeling emotional pain. It's difficult because we all say we're tired. And so we want to pay attention to the voice tone, volume, cadence of how some of these things are being said. But cryptic things like I won't be a problem much longer, all of those things we want to pay attention to. And of course, when I say pay attention to it, what I mean is we want to ask questions. When you say you won't be a problem much longer, what does that mean? Talking about death, dying, or not being around in the future, when I'm gone, if I were to die, we want to ask about all of those things. Clearly engaging in high-risk behavior, collecting dangerous objects. Recently, a colleague said to me, right, it's easier to get a gun than a cell phone or food in Pinellas County. Of the 6 teen deaths that we've reviewed, death by suicide of teens in Pinellas County, 5 of them died by gunshot. And it is easier to get a gun than a cell phone or food. In fact, children are trading cell phones for guns. These are things that we all need to be aware of and be paying attention to. We also need to understand anniversary dates. If you don't know the anniversary dates of youth that you are working with, that you spend a lot of time with, I would encourage you to pay attention, to try to get information around anniversary dates, maybe even note them on a calendar for yourself so that you can provide additional support. You can acknowledge the anniversary. It can be the date of a trauma, such as a death or a divorce, a difficult move. It can be seasonal. You notice that your student or your youth, your teen begins to, become sad or gloom, not feeling well, aches and pains during particular times of the year. Knowing anniversary dates can be helpful because we can support our youth around those dates. This idea that children forget if they're not talking about it, they don't remember, is hogwash. Children remember, and even if they're not talking about it, bodies remember, and often we will see the effects of past traumas and or anniversary dates. We know that 35% of suicides by our youth are planned, which means the vast majority of suicides by our teens are not planned. They are rather spontaneous, often with alcohol and or drugs preceding that decision. If it's planned, however, they might tell you. They might tell you without actually telling you. I have a family member, for example, who does things like stockpiles sleeping pills, goes to the store and purchases large quantities of sleeping aids and buys plugins. That means that she is having a very, very hard time. She is planning her death by suicide. Giving things away is one that we want to pay attention to. It sounds cliche, but it really is important. Children, students, teens begin giving away things that have been prized possessions for them, or asking you to take care of things. If anything happens to me, please take care of my pet, my record collection, those kinds of things. Actually saying goodbye, writing letters, making amends with family or friends, overly happy after an extended period of being low. We certainly see that people who have made the decision to die by suicide, often their mood elevates. They feel at peace with a decision that they've made. We're going to watch a video now of teens talking about suicide prevention. It is from the Mayo Clinic. I do hope that you, it maybe in the future, can go to the Mayo Clinic. They have wonderful, wonderful resources on this topic. The video is approximately 4 minutes in length.
I have my ups and downs, just like anybody else.
Maybe more than anybody else.
I can be hard to figure out.
And I like my privacy. I don't want you looking over my shoulder all the time.
But you know your kid better than anybody else. And if you think he's acting different than usual,
Acting really down, crying all the time for no good reason.
or getting really mad, not able to sleep, or sleeping too much,
Shutting her friends out or giving her stuff away.
acting reckless, drinking, using drugs, staying out late,
Suddenly not doing stuff he used to love.
or doing stuff that's just not like him.
It might be nothing to worry about. It might just be high school.
Or it might be something more. He might be depressed, not just feeling down, really depressed.
It might be that your kid is thinking about killing himself. It happens. More than you think. More than it should.
And people say, I had no idea.
I thought it was just a phase he was going through.
I never thought she'd do it.
I wish he'd come to
I
me.
wish he'd said something.
I wish I'd said something.
When it's too late. So if you think your kid's acting different, if she seems like a different person, say something.
Say, what's wrong? How can I help?
And ask straight out. Are you thinking about killing yourself? It doesn't hurt to ask. In fact, it helps.
When people are thinking about killing themselves, they want somebody to ask. They want somebody to care.
Maybe you're afraid you'll make it worse if you ask. Like, you'll put the idea in their head.
Believe me, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't hurt to ask. In fact, the best way to keep a teenager from killing herself is to ask. Are you thinking about killing yourself?
And what if they say yes?
Or maybe.
Or sometimes,
Well, here's what you don't say.
that's crazy.
Don't be such a drama
You're
queen.
making too much of this.
That boy's not worth killing yourself over. It's not going to solve anything.
You're just trying to get attention.
You're not going to kill yourself. What you do say is,
I'm sorry you're feeling so bad. How can I help? We'll get through this together.
Let's keep you safe.
A lot of people think about killing themselves, adults and kids. Most of them never try it, but some of them do. So if your kid says,
I'd be better off dead. I can't live with this.
I'm going to kill myself, take her seriously. Find someone she can talk to about it, someone who knows how to help.
Sometimes kids want to kill themselves because something happened. A breakup, a failure. But sometimes it goes deeper and it's not going to go away by itself. Get some help. Talk to your doctor.
Or a counselor at school.
Or your minister.
But don't just let it drop.
And make sure that your kid always has someone to turn to. Someone he trusts. Make a list together. Write them. 3, 4, 5 names.
Put the suicide hotline number on there too.
Have him keep that list in his wallet so he always knows where to turn.
Make sure your home is safe. If you have pills she could use to hurt herself, lock them up.
If you have a gun, just lock it up. Get it out of the house. Bullets too.
And one more thing. If you think your kid might be about to hurt himself, don't leave him alone.
Take him to the emergency room.
Call 911 if you have to.
We all have our ups and downs, but sometimes it's more than that.
If you think something's wrong, the only way to find out is to ask. Ask straight out. Are you thinking about killing yourself?
Don't wait until you're sure. Trust your gut, because it never hurts to ask.
And it can make a big difference, all the difference, in your kid's life.
Any mention of suicide requires immediate attention. This is another client quote that I would like to share. The bravest thing I've ever did was continue to live when I wanted to die, and no one really knows. We know that lots of people, our students and quite frankly adults, live with emotional pain that none of us may ever know about. It may be their struggle. If you're going to talk, I want to encourage all of us to talk to teens about suicide. Be prepared. As you heard in the video, I'm going to skip through this because I think I'm getting close to being out of time, unfortunately. But do be prepared. Obviously, you do not want to have an emotional response, as those teens just told us, you know, giving them all the reasons why they should want to live. Don't make it about you. Like, I would never, you know, be able to live with myself, you know, those kinds of things. Make a plan for professional help. There are some myths that we heard about in that video. I just want to focus on the first one, which is that if I ask a teen about thoughts of suicide, I'll put the idea in their head. Asking a student or a teen or anyone, quite frankly, about suicide, open lines of communication. It does not put the idea in their head. There is zero research to support that. So do be mindful that asking the question literally can save a life. So are you willing to ask that question? If I could see you, I would ask you to raise your hand if you are willing to ask a student, a teen, a youth, anyone in your life that you're concerned about. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? The question, are you thinking about hurting yourself, is not the question to ask. The question really needs to be very direct. The word suicide and or killing yourself is important part of the question. If you're uncomfortable talking to a teen about suicide or suicidal feelings, there are some strategies that you could use. You can kind of talk about it, you know, as an academic, you know, problem. Talk about the risks in treatment as opposed to about them personally. Displacement, you could talk about suicide in relation to someone specific that they may know, like Robin Williams or Kate Spade. Be willing to talk about mental health in general, if you're not willing at this moment to talk about suicide, but about mental health, about feelings of overwhelmed, feelings of depression, feelings of suicide, of loneliness, sad, those kinds of things. Be willing to talk about them. Naturally, self-help is important. Things like exercise, good nutrition, encouraging our youth to vent feelings like singing along to music, journaling, creating art, those kinds of things. Sometimes simply sitting with someone can make the difference between life and death. I do want to encourage all of us to provide emotional support for our children. Obviously, there's professional help. I always want to encourage people to use their primary care physicians, pediatricians, faith leaders, reaching out to mental health professionals, and of course, the hotline. Everybody should have that hotline number memorized. It should be in your phone. We should be putting it in kids' phones. The NAMI text feature can also be used, and I think that's being put in the chat feature right now. I want to talk a little bit about prevention. There's a lot of things that we can do to prevent teen suicide. Pay attention to our youth. Don't undervalue any of the things that they're saying and or going through. Make sure we store firearms, alcohol, medications, those kinds of things in very, very safe places. Or as the video said, the teen on the video said, don't even have them in your house if you can. There are protective factors that certainly we want to pay attention to. I assume that every one of us on this webinar here today can be a protective factor to youth. One caring and consistent adult really can save a life. It can make a difference between life and death for our children. So be that person, be that one caring, consistent adult in a youth's life. I'm going to skip the mailman story because of our time. This is a national resource, which is the confidential line that we've talked about here several times. Please make sure that you know this number. You can also register for Youth Mental Health First Aid. You're going to get a flyer, I think, after this course today. Encourage a teen to Teen Mental Health First Aid course. Understand that there are very specific resources for our high-risk populations. There's a Trans Lifeline, GLBT National Hotline, the Trevor Lifeline Project, and then, of course, the resource of NAMI. If I was with you, I would ask you, what do you see here, and give you a minute to look at this. Hopefully what you are seeing is opportunity is now here, as opposed to opportunity is nowhere. As you can see, these letters spell both of those things. Opportunity is nowhere and opportunity is now here. It really does depend on how you look at it. And I think together, all of us can make a difference in the life of our children. And I'm so grateful to have been here with you today. And I thank you for your time and your attention.
Thanks so much, April. Before we move to our panelists, I do want to ask two very short questions. We are going to have time for a Q&A following the panel, but these two things were specifically related. You mentioned some plugins. Can you just say, what is a plugin?
So this family member, when she is contemplating and or planning her death by suicide, she goes to the CVS and she purchases large quantities of sleeping medication, PM medications, and she purchases plugins that smell good. She plugs them in because she wants to cover up the smell if she were to actually be successful with her death. And so that's for someone who is, that's for her when she's, as she plans a suicide. We just have to be aware that if our students, if our teens are planning a suicide, they will do certain things, begin to collect things like over-the-counter PM medications or other things that can be lethal, guns, knives, those kinds of things. If you start noticing or observing, a teen or a student, someone that you are working with, collecting things that could become lethal, pay attention to that.
Okay, thank you. And one other thing, when you were talking about language of persons who commit suicide or complete suicide, someone asked, is it ever wrong to say that someone took their own life?
To say someone took their own life is okay to say. There are better ways maybe to say that. Completed suicide as opposed to a successful suicide. Sometimes we hear people use words like, it was a successful suicide or committed suicide. Those things suggest that there is it is sometimes offensive to use words like that to suggest that it was a successful, suicide, or, so saying died by suicide is probably the best way, I think, to refer to someone who has died by suicide.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And April is going to stay with us as we move through the panel. There may be some other things that we share and we'll get her feedback on. But we are going to move over to William/Bill Pellan, who's the Director of Investigations with District 6 Medical Examiner's Office. That is the district that covers Pinellas County. And before moving to our Pinellas Pasco office in 2000, he investigated cases for the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's Office. Bill is a subject matter expert and valued member of the local child abuse death review and preventable child death teams. He was instrumental in setting up the Sleep Babies Safely campaign, which you may have seen in Pinellas County, and it's even supporting its expansion into Duval County. He has passionately driven local and statewide reform to debunk myths around SIDS as the cause of infant sleep-related deaths, and he has been interviewed numerous times on this subject and others, and feels strongly that direct language, consistent messaging, and education are key to protecting children from sleep-related suffocation and ultimately saving their lives. Bill's a father of 3, and in his own words says, "I see the worst case scenarios. I don't see the ones who make it. And then I take that home." This is what drives Bill's passion for prevention and his work to prevent the needless deaths of all children from all unnatural causes, whether it's infant sleep-related deaths or drownings or suicides. We're so happy that Bill is able to share with us today some of this work, and that we can say a big thank you to him for all he does for our community. Bill, turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joanne, for that welcome and description of myself and my past. You're very kind and generous with your words. So as you mentioned, I'm with the medical examiner's office, and those people that may not be familiar with the medical examiner, we in Florida, the medical examiner is required to, and this is by Florida law, required to investigate and determine the causes of death of certain deaths falling with circumstances falling under our jurisdiction. This typically is non-natural disease type deaths. So that would include accidents and homicides and of course suicides, which is what we're talking about today here with this group. So in the work that we do, we generate, we record and generate a lot of information, and so really I think my role and participation with teen suicide is really a lot dealing with statistics and what are we seeing. To kind of follow up on what April with Directions for Living was saying, suicide, especially teen suicide, is not something that is out in the media, that is well publicized. And so what I'm going to do is follow up with that and let everyone know the reality of the prevalence of teen suicide. And when I talk about teen suicide, I'm talking about those deaths that occur of persons under the age of 18. And I'm referring to those deaths in Pinellas County. So what I did was I went back and I looked at the past 11 years. I went back to 2010 to get a representation or retrospective look at the deaths of teens that were from suicide. And in looking at those 11 years, what I found was that on average each year, we handle 2.8 deaths by suicide from teens, those under the age of 18. And so if you look at that average of 2.8, and pretty much throughout the years from 2010 all the way to 2019, that's about right. It was 2, 3, 4 a year. Of course, one is too many, but it stayed pretty consistent. The lowest year being in 2016, where there was only one suicide death from a teen, and that's through 2019. And then for whatever reason, there may be many different theories. In 2020, we had a pretty significant uptick in teen suicide, and there were actually 6 last year in 2020. And so that's over double of what typically we face each year in Pinellas County. And then looking at so far this year, so through the first 7.5 months of 2021, we have had 3 deaths so far. So with being a little bit over halfway through the year, we've already are at the average. So, and then looking in more detail as to those deaths. So if I go back to 2010, there were a total of 32 deaths of teenagers by suicide. The average age for those deaths was 15. And out of the 32 total deaths, 21 were male and 11 were female. I know we heard April talk about there were some statistics on girls are more likely to seek out for treatment than males, and maybe that's reflected also in the deaths that we see with almost twice as many male than we have female. Out of those 32 deaths, 13 were by gunshot, 4 were by hanging, 4 were drug-related, drug overdose, and 1 was drowning. Back to the age, and this is really oftentimes hard to wrap your mind around. It certainly is for me, and I see tragedy every day. But when we talk about the age and the average age of 15, one thing I'll mention was the youngest during this 11-year period was age 10. And as a matter of fact, we have had 2 deaths involving 10-year-old children by suicide. And so that's really, it's really hard to, like I say, hard to wrap your mind around, but also I think it's important that it sends a message. And again, what I'm talking about is really the reality of it, that this does occur, and we've seen it even as young as the age of 10. And so that's really about all that I had to share with the group. I know it's not the, that's not the most pleasant information, but I believe that if we can, really look at what's going on with our community, sometimes we have to look at the hard, facts and truth, and is even as unpleasant as it may be, and identify how people are dying in order to make a difference or to help those that may need it, that are living. So I was asked maybe to go in a little bit more detail, the deaths in 2020 and 2020 that were gunshot related. Again, that we had that pretty significant increase in last year in teen suicides. Last year, as a matter of fact, one of those deaths did involve a 10-year-old. Out of those 6, 4 of those were from gunshot wound, and 1 was drug related and 1 was hanging. I think April had mentioned, it's everybody's right, and it's a good idea to ask questions if your children are maybe at other people's homes. Are there any significant concerns or dangers related to access to firearms? And I think that's the biggest thing is for me, it's not about necessarily the gun control. It's about securing those firearms and using, due diligence to make sure that they're kept safe from those that should not be having access. Joanne, do we have any other questions or anything?
Not specifically at this time, but there may be some later. Want to thank you so much for sharing and being with us. If we're going to take questions at the end so we can continue moving forward. Just one clarifying thing. The statistics that you mentioned, the last statistics, that larger number, that was for the entire 11-year data collection, right?
The larger number of 32 actually was for the 11 years plus the first half of 2021. So actually 11 and a half years, 32 total.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you for having me, and I'll be happy to answer questions should they come up.
Yes. And there are some other things, so we will come back. If there are any questions at the end that we don't have time to get to, because I want to get to our other panelists, we will be answering them, reaching out to the people to get the information to them. We are going to send everybody resource information to everybody who's a part, and this is being recorded and the link will go out to everybody. So fear not if we don't get, but we have 2 more amazing panelists that we need to hear from. And the next is Donna Sicilian. For those of you who don't know her, she's the Executive Director of Student Services for Pinellas County Public Schools. You may know her from the big campaign, Grade Level Reading, Early Years. She's done that attendance awareness campaign. She thought up that would reach all the elementary, middle schools to get those banners around. And JWB partnered with the rapper about the Everyday Counts. So you may know some of her efforts on that. In addition, there was coloring books created and distributed to all the schools. But besides that, Donna is involved in a community task force consisting of both community and school personnel to review data, to seek out best practices, and identify ways to create a community approach to better encourage school attendance. She was instrumental, for example, in elementary schools. They were encouraged to place a welcome back note on students' desks if they were absent and then returned. Can you imagine? That's such a wonderful thing. And they analyzed a process for identifying students struggling with attendance and instituted child study teams within schools to identify the major issues and execute strategies of support. Donna's involved in so many things throughout our county, and I tell you, she cares passionately about the work that she does, and truly, unfortunately, has had to hear the news when a child does commit suicide and is often on the ground with those students, the peers they've left behind. So we're so happy Donna is with us today to share a few minutes about the work she's doing and ways that we can get involved to support her in her efforts.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate the organizers of this event, including schools, because I think we're often overlooked as a partner in this work, and schools really do have a role it would be wonderful if schools could focus only on writing and math and some of the academic work that we do. But I always say that schools are kind of a microcosm of society. And so all of the issues and struggles, the good and the bad that occur in our community take place and impact the work that we have in schools. So we most definitely are a partner in youth mental health. And so I just want to share a little bit about what we do in schools so that you are aware of our efforts and how we can work together and some of the things that we've learned that might be helpful to others that work with youth. So one of our big roles and one of the things we want to focus on is prevention. We want to work with providing students with resiliency and the skills to be able to deal with their issues prior to it reaching a point where they are of such despair that they begin to even contemplate suicide. So we do that in a number of ways. We have student services staff, we have school counselors, psychologists, social workers, nurses in every single one of our schools. And I know there's several people from schools on the call today, and I just want to say a public thank you for the work that you do. When Joanne introduced me and said, this is what she's doing, it's not what I'm doing. I'm reporting to you what these staff in these schools go out and do every single day. We are saturating our school community with training to better help the adults that are in these children's lives recognize when children are beginning to struggle. We too provide youth mental health first aid. We provide trauma-informed care. We provide suicide prevention training for school staff, and that's everyone. We include bus drivers, we include our custodial staff, our cafeteria, everyone that intersects with children's lives. We want them to recognize possible signs of any kind of social emotional distress in children early on. We've also incentivized some of those trainings. We have an individual accreditation we call the micro-credential in mental health. So any staff that have taken a combination of trainings can become micro-credentialed in mental health. And then also schools can become suicide prevention certified when all of the staff at their schools have received the trainings as well. So really educating the adults in students' lives is a very important first step and a real role that schools have. Oftentimes we are the one consistent entity in a child and a family's life. So we also work with students in helping them recognize signs in their peers. And so we've partnered for several years now with the Sandy Hook Promise organization. And it is a continuum of services that includes things such as Start with Hello, which is try to undermine some of that isolation that can occur that April mentioned about. And all the way through, we have a See Something, Say Something training that's provided to all middle and high school students so that they can recognize signs of distress in their peers and the difference between telling a trusted adult and quote snitching and that it comes to motive. And then we provide means for students to report that. Obviously, they can come to anyone's office, but a lot of times youth these days, they're on their phone, they're using technology. So part of the partnership with Sandy Hook Promise includes an anonymous reporting system that can be done by phone on the web, but primarily students and adults and anyone in the community utilize an app that we have the students download onto their phones during the training. And to date, we have had over 6,000 tips come through, and we have just had hundreds and hundreds that were what we call life safety. And they come through 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we respond with local law enforcement when it's the middle of the night. And I just know that this alone has saved lives. We also provide at least 5 hours of mental health training for all middle and high school students in the school. And our team, our student services staff, have worked with teaching and learning and developed training so that we cover a variety of topics and that they change every year so that students are getting new information on some of these topics and expanding their knowledge. And this year we got feedback from students that they wanted to have students more involved. So a lot of the training and the videos were actually having students recorded. So we take feedback from kids, we listen to kids, and that's really the #1 message. I will add that one of the things that we do is crisis response. And so anytime there's any sort of crisis, and that would involve the death of a staff member, the death of a student, including students who may have died by suicide, we go out. In addition to the staff assigned to the school, we often have to send additional student service team members to the site because these deaths affect everyone so greatly. And one of the things that we've learned, and that was really how we got involved with Sandy Hook, these kids typically were not on any adult's radar. They weren't students that we were seeing. As April mentioned, a lot of times they were just feeling a lot of pressure. They were high achieving athletes, unknown to the adults in the system that are targeted for supporting kids with mental health issues. But the kids knew that kids were struggling or that things were happening at home or at school. And so we wanted a way to train youth on recognizing what they're hearing and a way for them to tell trusted adults. And that's really how we started with Sandy Hook Promise. But I'll also add that one of the things that we've noticed that is different this past year since COVID is that increase in isolation. So we have seen more students die by suicide that we were aware of were struggling, and that we were providing a lot of service at schools to support the student. And then what happened was all of a sudden we went into shutdown back in March of 2020, and the student did not have access to those services. While we all scrambled to try to do our best to provide the same level of care, it's just very different when everything became online. And that's why it's so important to us to find a way to safely keep schools open, because the isolation itself is very detrimental to students' health and well-being. The other thing that I would mention is the importance of working together as a community and being able to review these deaths when they occur so that we can look at trends that helps us with prevention. We certainly don't determine in the schools a cause of death. We leave that to Bill and his team. But usually we're out there the next day at the school, and the medical examiner has not completed their report, but we may hear from law enforcement, we may hear from the family, we may hear from other students that it is suspected that this death was a death by suicide. And so we do handle those a little differently because we are concerned about something called contagion, which I know I don't have time to go into, but we do try our best to help the adults and the children manage their grief while screening for other students that may be in distress and preventing any kind of contagion. So I think I'm probably over my time already, but I just hope that I've been able to help you understand kind of the school's role, the things that we are doing in schools and in our community. The one thing I wanted to close with was April mentioned stigma, and that's something that we deal with as well. The kind of stigma around students both having mental health concerns, and then if in fact we're being told a student had died by suicide, that the extreme difficulty that people have with saying that often can shut down other children from talking, other students from talking. So I think that's a real important thing for the community to understand, that we really need to be willing to listen to whatever the student wants to say to us. And then we need to keep our shocked faces to ourselves and be able to hear from children so that they really know that they can talk to us. So thank you for including us.
Thanks so much, Donna. There were 2 questions that I'm going to ask for you to put some more information in the chat feature to the full group about who qualifies for micro credentialing, something that you mentioned, and what does that really entail? And if there's, I don't know, a link or something, or if someone was wanting more information, if you could put something in the chat on that. And also you mentioned an app for sending tips. If you could put that in.
That's in the chat now. Denise added that. And the micro-credential is specific to school board employees.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Donna. Now moving over to Dr. Terry Collier. I don't know if you know Terry, but he has been working in our area, in our community. He's been the clinical director of the counseling ministry over at Anona Family Counseling Center. He has over 30 years combined as an ordained minister, as well as providing individual family counseling. He's also very much connected to the Rock in Madeira Beach, and that he's going to spend some time talking about that. And his expertise in the counseling world, he is involved with PTSD, trauma, like April talked about, disaster response, compassion fatigue, sexual addiction, substance abuse issues, grief and loss, a full range. And so we're so pleased to have him. Terry, if you also in your conversation with us today could address specifically, if you in educational opportunities that are out there for youth ministers at their churches, someone asked, how can we get them more information other than the great programs that we're going to put on our resource sheet that Directions for Living is doing? Are there some tips that you've seen coming out of the faith world for youth leaders at the church? Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Joanne and Adrian and all of the team that organized this event. You've done a fabulous job. April, thank you for a great presentation. You certainly gave us a lot of insight, statistics. These are things that we need to be aware of, and everybody who participated on the panel. It's kind of an honor for me just to be with you. My journey with some of these organizations started back in 2010 when I worked at the public safety campus of St. Pete College, where we had the police academy, the fire academy, and we did some pilot projects with DCF and the city of St. Petersburg Fire Department, police department, recognizing that we have a real disconnect between some of our youth in the community and our public safety first responders. And so we put some programs together for that. But I want to talk a few minutes about Rock Park. Rock Park is spelled R-O-C, and you'll see a couple of pictures. This is the heart of Madeira Beach Parks and Recreation. ROC stands for Remember Our Children. Back in 2015, this park was being remodeled. They scraped the entire 12 acres of the beautiful property right there at Madeira Beach on a peninsula in the water. And Bill and Diana Carnes had just lost their son. His name was Billy. It wasn't death by suicide, but it was a tragic death. And one of the things that Bill and Diana wanted to do is not go to the cemetery and sit in grief around all of the tombstones and memorials that were there. But he said, I wanted to remember my son in the happy times of life. And so there was a meeting with the city of Madeira and the opportunity to provide landscaping, because landscaping for this 12 acres was not in the budget. And so Bill and several people in the community raised about $2 million. Every tree, every plant, every blade of grass was provided by Rock Park Foundation. Remember Our Children. And so it was Bill and Diana's vision that we can create a community where families that have lost children can come together. And it's a place to gather. It's a place to see children playing, having a good time, remembering the life of their loved one, and then learning from that, building this community and providing a place to gather. We are looking at, well, they've had fishing tournaments, we've had concerts, we've had special events to bring awareness. And as each person in the panel, and April, you talked about prevention. One of the things that I can visualize in prevention in our community is coming to a place to gather and learning how to listen to not only one another, to learn, but the one thing I've learned in counseling is this. The most important key to counseling is learning how to listen. And we can gather statistics. We can learn all the matrix dynamics and everything involved around death by suicide. And it is helpful. It's very insightful. But what we need to start doing is changing the dynamic where we start listening to those who are going through the struggle. And Donna, I like what you said about training bus drivers and teachers and staff workers and everybody in the school system to be what to look for. What are the signs? And those signs are out there. One thing that I've learned in listening is that it's the key. It's the key to helping someone who is struggling know that someone cares. And one of the key thoughts that I've heard many times is, can you see me? Can you see me in the crowd? Can you see me in society? Can you see the struggle in my face, in my eyes, in my behavior? And so, you know, that's Rock Park is a place that I would really like to say that we want to offer the opportunity. There are now over 400 families that have given memorials. You're looking at a lovelock tree here. It was there's probably 100 or so locks that have been fastened back in the bushes that you see behind. That's a butterfly garden. And in that butterfly garden on the bottom, you can see some rocks and you can see a bench. And each family that has made a memorial to Rock Park has left a name and a date and a story, and they've all got stories. And so, you know, here's the place that we can come together as community providers, as social groups, and trying to learn. There is a big band shell. We've actually had as many as 7,000 people in concert there. And one of the things that we can do as a community is organize events where we can bring the community together and bring young people, bring our adolescents. The one thing that, you know, another theme that keeps coming out is mental health. You know, death by suicide is a mental health issue. And the more we understand about the developing adolescent mind, the brain, the more we can understand how to put preventative measures out there and communicate to our young people. There is a shifting paradigm, and part of that shifting paradigm, several of you have brought up, has to do with COVID. And COVID has changed. It has put a lot of added stress, isolation, loneliness, depression. And, you know, Bill Carnes, the developer of Rock Park, told me that since 2015 to 2020, we've had 20 families that have made memorials here to children that have died to suicide. He says since COVID to this date in 2020, Joanne said we shut down in March of 2020 up until now, there are over 20 families. So it's doubled what took place in 5 years is now 1 year, 1 year and a few months. One of our local leaders in the faith community is Father Rick over at Blessed Sacrament Church. Father Rick has walked these pavers and this park many times with families. And one of the statements that he says that I think is something that we can all quote, and I don't know if Father Rick, it's original with him, but he says that suicide is the heart attack of depression. And I said, you know, you really articulated that. That's it. It's the heart attack of depression, because depression is one of the centerpieces of the mental illness that these young people are going through. So I think the more things that we do to collaborate together, the better off we will be. I will tell you that Bill Carnes and I met in July of 2019, on July the 1st. We had 2 days notice that a group of mothers were going to be gathering from all over the country at Rock Park. These were mothers that had lost at least one child to an opioid related issue. And they have now a national organization called Not in Vain. Bill and I met with these 100 mothers for about 2 hours as they came to make a memorial, but they also gathered from all over the country to collaborate. How can we bring awareness and prevention to this opioid crisis that we have in our nation? And I called Sheriff Galtieri's office, and only 2 days notice, he couldn't make it, but he sent 4 deputies out. And for 2 hours, the 4 deputies and Bill and I we met with these mothers and listened to their stories. And it wasn't easy, because some of those stories, you know, really had a criticism about what they heard the police officers say when they found their child. Comments like, well, it's just another druggie. And, you know, I've got to give it to our sheriff's department. They sat, they listened, and then later I learned that all 4 of the deputies came off duty. They weren't on duty. They came voluntarily and they listened to these mothers. That was a gathering that showed me that here is a place that is not political. It is not territorial. And we truly can come together and collaborate at this place. And I hope that we can have concerts, that we can have fishing tournaments, that we can have gatherings that will actually bring our young people out to the park so that we can see them and we can listen to them. And so, you know, that's just an offer. I'm really delighted to come back out of, you know, what I call my my cave and doing one-on-one counseling with families and individuals, and now coming back out into the public forum and shake, you know, just holding hands with colleagues, learning together, collaborating, and doing things together, because we are better together. So we're going to start putting those together, and I hope after, this is by Julia Bowen. Julia Bowen's son, Andrew, took his life, and Julia was able to put together a grant, and this bench is actually at Rock Park on the paver sidewalk. And it's these yellow benches are all over the country, and we were able to get one put here. It's a national landmark, but it's a reminder that anybody walking in the park, that here is a number that they can call, and it's a lifeline. So I know that this has been long and a lot of information. What I'm offering is an opportunity and a place for us to gather and put the prevention plans in place in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Terry, just real briefly, for people who aren't familiar with Madeira Beach, other than the beach aspect, can you just share a little bit about where it is if they were driving?
Yes, if you go to Madeira Beach, the new Cambria Hotel that is right there. There is it's right across the street from Archibald Park, which is the beach park there. And there's a Winn-Dixie, there's a fire department, Madeira Beach Parks and Recreation. You go right past, you turn left on, I think it's 150th, and you'll see a sign that goes right back into the Parks and Recreation. And it's just a beautiful setting. You can go online, Rock Park, I think it's .org, and there's actually a website. There's drone videos, and Joanne, I can get the website to you and we can post that. But yeah, it's a really nice website and presentation from an aerial view.
Everybody is getting the resource page tomorrow, and the link to the website is on there, as well as it's in the chat. Denise posted the address, so just wanted to help people know since it is in our county. Thank you so much, Terry, for all you're doing, and we look forward to more events coming up that we can be supportive of. I know that there was another question in the chat that we did get answered by Bill about whether or not the statistics he offered separate out whether or not that includes any LGBTQ folks because of the high risk that they're involved. I'm not sure and maybe Donna would know this, or April, when you all are reviewing the death review cases, is that in the narrative? Do you have any idea if that's segmented out at all, to know that if the person who died was LGBTQ?
Well, we wouldn't have that information at the schools. I guess maybe Bill might know.
Bill said it's not kept on the statistic, but I didn't know if maybe in the other kind of review. Okay. Well, we certainly know it's a high-risk group, and we need to continue to be supportive in ways we can. I know April's done a great job supporting a lot of LGBTQ teen youth groups. So anything that we can do, I just can't thank the panel enough. We're coming to the end of our time. I want to especially thank the planning team. And Jess is going to put up a slide of all the organizations that have been a part. Someone that's not pictured here is Jocelyn Boxkajay, a young woman on the JWB Teens Council who was instrumental in doing the artwork for our promotion, and the backdrop slide that you saw when you first entered the room. And just a reminder that this is recorded, and we will post this on the JWB YouTube channel group. We'll send everybody a link to where it is on. It's going to take about a week before it will get posted, but tomorrow you'll be receiving both the survey. If you're not able to fill it out today, when you get offline, you should get a link about the survey for today's group, the webinar. You'll also get the resource sheet tomorrow, and it's got a lot of helpful information. And then the following week, we will have the video posted where you can review that, as well as review our human trafficking and other videos that we've done with this webinar series. So thanks again so much for taking time out of your day to be with us on this very important topic. We are so fortunate in Pinellas County to have some of these great leaders with us. April, you do amazing work, and on the whole committee that you worked with, just like Donna says, it takes so many people behind all of us. So thank you so much for all that you're doing. And again, thanks for joining us. And if we can save one life, it's worth it. Appreciate all of you.